Okay, good noontime to all. I want to be cognizant of people's time, so get started fairly on time. But as people join, just some housekeeping. We will be recording, just so you know, and we will be providing that in a follow-up email to y'all for those who've registered on Zoom. This will also be hosted on Facebook Live, and there'll be a link there for those of you who'd like to share out for people who could not register in advance. I am going to get started with our issue investigation. Specifically today, we are working on protecting our marsage from fragmentation. We've brought a great lineup of really, really smart panelists to talk to you about that. The issue investigation main goal is to think about all the issues that are currently affecting the Georgia coast and how we can learn to and provide to you ways to access and learn and advocate for your coast. So without further ado, I'll get started. My name is Eric Swanson. I've been talking to you as you're joining. I'm the Advocacy Education Coordinator for 100 Miles. For those of you who don't know much about 100 Miles, we are an advocacy education community engagement organization that protects the Georgia coast. We're all about making people a better advocate for the coast, making people have that access to our coast, to those natural, wonderful, beautiful places that we all love. For my job, I do education around advocacy, but also have a background as a naturalist. I'm going to do a quick run of show, an agenda for today. Welcome everyone. I'll introduce the panelists. We'll do a brief issue overview from me, and then we'll talk for about kind of the mechanisms for protecting the marsh from the law standpoint. We'll talk about increasing threats to our marsh, what's happening currently. We'll talk about impacts to marsh obligate bird species. We'll go a little bit through the rulemaking process and how you can get involved and take action. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please do, if those questions are coming up, put them in the Q&A in the Zoom or comment on Facebook if you're on Facebook, and we'll get those moved over. I would like to introduce one of our first panelists, April Lipscomb. She's a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and we'll talk a lot about those laws around what was and has been and where we're at now with long docks specifically and the impacts of long docks on the marsh from a fragmentation standpoint. Courtney Reich with the Georgia Conservancy is also going to talk broadly about those aspects of impacts to our marsh and how new rules could change the face of our marsh forever, for the future. Dr. Rob Cooper with UGA is going to be really diving into the specific marsh obligate species of birds and how those are affected and talk about the science behind those birds and how impacts of long docks change the way that they interact with the marsh. And then Alice Kais, also with 100 Miles, who has been the spearhead person behind getting all these wonderful people together and bringing them here for you today, is going to talk about actions that can be taken, what we can do as advocates, and how we can be involved in this process. I'm going to start out, though. I've got the kind of the luxury of starting out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the basis for why we're doing issue investigations as 100 Miles. So they serve to highlight and demystify the very real issues our coasts face. We hope that through these webinars that you are empowered. We want to get individuals out there to advocate on behalf of these issues. This broad series of issue investigations will have lots of topics we cover, and we will probably cover the marsh much more in the future. But for right now, we're talking about long docks and marsh fragmentation. The possibility of loss of uninterrupted marsh habitats due to these proposed longer docks are really why we're here today, and we're going to take a kind of deep dive on that. So feel free if you have any specific questions to drop those in the chat. I am going to wear my kind of environmental educator hat a little bit today. It's what I fall back on because it's where I started with the Georgia Marsh. So we're going to talk about all of these um, things that make the marsh important by doing marsh metaphors, and I'm going to go through them quickly in the interest of times. But marshes are homes to plants and animals that are unique and that can only live there. So that's one reason why they're important. They're important as a sponge, right? They're important as a sponge because they absorb water and they help to filter water and they protect us from storms. That's why we got the pair of wellies out there, right? Flooding effects are mitigated by having intact marsh. They're a sink, they're a carbon sink. So they store carbon and they're really good at doing that. And disrupting the marsh actually interrupts the ability of the marsh to act as a carbon sink. They protect us during storms, like I said, with that umbrella. They also filter water, and they filter fresh water and brackish water, salt water, where they mix, and they create that filtration system, and they provide really, really good ecosystem services in that way. They're intrinsically beautiful. People make art about them. They are featured in poems. Georgia coast marshes are some of the best in the world, right? They're massive, they're expansive, but even little tiny um, interruptions can have massive effects, especially on those animals that use them as a nursery and raise their young here or have their young here because it's a sheltered, protective, and highly nutrient-rich place to have young. And then the recreation side of things. Marshes provide opportunities for fishing and hunting and recreating, boating. We are really, really, really wanting marsh just to be able to be accessed. We don't want to do that at the detriment to the marsh. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I am going to actually pass it directly on to April, who's going to talk about some of the legal side of things and where we are coming from and where we're at now. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it to you, April, and I'm going to mute myself. And
Okay, I'm going to take it away. Thank you, Eric. That last slide was actually really great. I might have to use that with my kids to explain marsh. So good afternoon, everybody. Like Eric said, my name is April Lipscomb. I'm a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. I've had the privilege of being there and working with partners like 100 Miles for over 10 years now. So I'm really excited to be here. For those of you who may not know SELC, we are the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental legal advocacy organization rooted in and focused on the South. So we have lawyers, we have policy experts, and community advocates, and we work to protect our air, water, land, wildlife, and all the people who live here. And that includes Georgia's amazingly beautiful coastal marshlands and people like all of you who care about learning about and protecting this natural system. So again, my goal here today is to provide you all with some legal background on how docks have been regulated in Georgia, ways they can be regulated, and set the stage, I hope, well for the other panelists for today's issue investigation. So just to jump right in, I want to start by recognizing that our coastal marshlands belong actually to all of us, right? So the state of Georgia owns the marsh and the bed of all tidal waterways in trust for the public. And this has been recognized going all the way back to when Georgia first became a state, and it's now codified in the Protection of Tidewaters Act. Some of that language from that act is on this slide. And just to point out that last section, the General Assembly finds that the state of Georgia is trustee of the rights of the people of the state to use and enjoy all tidewaters, which are capable of use for fishing, passage, navigation, commerce, and transportation pursuant to the common law public trust doctrine. And I'll just add that even though it says tidewaters, the beds of tidewaters includes the actual salt marsh. So it goes all the way up to the ordinary high watermark. So just a caveat, there are some instances where marsh can be privately owned, but those are few and far between. That's the exception, not the norm. So because the state owns the marsh in trust for us, it has a duty to protect it and to regulate it so that we, the public, can continue to use and enjoy it. So if we go to the next slide, on top of that duty, the state of Georgia also has express authority under our Constitution to actually enact laws that restrict land use to protect the environment, the natural resources, and the vital areas of our state. And in this case, the General Assembly has done that with the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act. So, right off the bat, in passing that act, the General Assembly recognized that the coastal marshlands of Georgia comprise a vital natural resource system. And they also recognize this system is costly, if not impossible, to reconstruct or rehabilitate once adversely affected by man-made activities. That is really powerful language to me. And therefore, the General Assembly said that marshlands must be regulated to ensure that these values and functions are not impaired for future generations. So generally speaking, the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, or the CMPA, it prohibits construction of any structure in the marsh without first obtaining a permit or a letter of permission from the Coastal Marshlands Protection Committee. In addition to that, anyone who wants to build something like a marina or a community dock or a commercial dock, they also have to get a water bottom lease from the committee. So in other words, they have to get permission to build, and then they have to pay a rental fee, essentially, to use those state-owned water bottoms. And the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act gives the DNR Board, the Department of Natural Resources Board, the authority to promulgate rules and regulations to implement those permitting and leasing requirements. So in this case, the DNR Board has adopted rules that place restrictions on certain types of docks. And specifically under the CMPA, we're talking about community docks, commercial docks, and marinas. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm not going to get into all of the requirements, but this slide just demonstrates some of the ways that DNR's rules regulate these types of docks. So for instance, a Tier 3 community dock, which is the largest type of community dock, or a commercial dock walkway shall not exceed 6 feet in width, 1,000 feet in length, and not exceed 3,000 square feet of effective shading impact. They have to be constructed at a height above all vegetation, but not more than 6 feet above grade. If these docks span a tributary that is less than 10 feet wide, it can, but it has to have a minimum clearance of 6 feet between the high water line and the bottom of the walkway to allow for navigation. The fixed platform at the end can be covered in screens, but not fully enclosed. And then there are similar restrictions for marinas, right? So launch pier shall not exceed 1,000 feet in length. The pedestrian walkway shall not exceed 1,000 feet in length and shall not exceed 3,000 square feet of effective shading impact. And marinas have a bunch of other regulations as well. For instance, they can't be sited within 1,000 feet of waters approved for shellfish harvesting by the Coastal Resources Division. So needless to say, the CMPA places a lot of restrictions and a lot of reasonable restrictions on permitting requirements and leasing requirements for people wanting to build community docks, commercial docks, and marinas. We'll go to the next slide. However, the CMPA does not recreate private recreational docks. In fact, it expressly exempts private recreational docks from those permitting and water bottom leasing requirements that those other types of docks have to meet. So, that really begs the question, how has the state of Georgia then complied with its public trust obligation to protect coastal marshlands for the public with respect to these private recreational docks? Well, again, these are state-owned properties, right? And by law in Georgia, if we have state-owned property and there are no laws that actually regulate that property, the governor actually has supervision over that property and authority to regulate it. And in this case, and can delegate that authority. So the governor has delegated to the Coastal Resources Division authority to regulate private recreational docks. And the way they've done that is through the issuance of revocable licenses. Next slide, please. So in other words, what happens is the Coastal Resources Division issues revocable licenses to landowners that want to build private recreational docks, and those licenses essentially give permission to those landowners to use the state-owned water bottoms and the marshlands. Now, importantly, the United States Army Corps of Engineers also regulates private recreational docks under the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act, which I won't get into the weeds but just to be aware of that, that's important. And in the early 2000s, CRD staff and the Corps actually worked together to streamline that process. And they put together a joint programmatic general permit that had standards in it for private recreational docks, including limitations on walkway length and total square footage. And that programmatic general permit has been reissued every 5 years, the last of which was in 2017. And it was the Coastal Resources Division's longstanding practice to authorize private recreational docks that complied with the standards in that programmatic general permit. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the standards, but just to give you an idea of what that programmatic general permit includes, it prohibited private recreational dock walkways in Georgia from exceeding 1,000 feet in length, 6 feet in width, and 3,000 square feet in total area. If that sounds familiar, it should, because very similar standards apply to community docks and marinas that we just covered in the CMPA. I also included here a chart or a table, which is very hard to read, so I apologize for that, but it compares Georgia to some of our neighboring states. As a comparison, in South Carolina, private dock walkways cannot exceed 1,000 feet in length, including all structures. They have to be a little more narrow, so only 4 feet in width. In Florida, the total area, including the walkway and the terminal end of private recreational docks, cannot exceed 2,000 square feet. So when you look at this, the main takeaway is that, at least historically, Georgia's standards have not been more restrictive than our neighboring states, and in some respects have actually been more permissive for private recreational docks. So, if that has been our reality, why are we now here? Why are we having this issue investigation? In 2022, the Corps actually decided not to reissue the programmatic general permit for private recreational docks. So what that means is those standards that were in that permit are no longer in effect, and the Coastal Resources Division can't rely on standards that don't exist anymore. So now the DNR board is considering a rulemaking to establish standards that private recreational docks would have to meet in order to have permission, in order to proceed with that revocable licensing process. So that's where we are now, and I'm going to turn it over to the next panelist, who are going to get into why this rulemaking process is so important and why we really need to consider the impacts that these long docks have on our coastal marshlands. So thank you all, and I will be here for questions at the end.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, April, for that really clear talk through a lot of complex permitting and rules and regulations. My name is Courtney Reich. I'm the Coastal Director for Georgia Conservancy. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, Georgia Conservancy, we're one of the older land conservation focused nonprofits in Georgia. We've been around since 1967. And we really work to support that symbiotic relationship between healthy ecosystems and thriving communities. One of our main focuses right now is salt marsh protection and future marsh migration area conservation through a program called the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, or SASMI, for those of you who might be familiar with that. And one of the reasons that we are focused in this landscape is because our coastal marshlands are under significant pressure right now, both from sea level rise that is occurring here in on the Southeast Atlantic coast, some of the fastest relative rates of sea level rise here in the world. And at that same time, we also have encroaching development. I think everybody that lives here in coastal Georgia is familiar with the increasing rates of development we're seeing here in coastal Georgia. And so what that is causing is what we like to call the coastal squeeze. Our marsh is getting pressured from both sides. This development that is occurring is also impacting hydrology, which changes freshwater flows to our marsh. It can affect sediment loads, either increasing it through erosion and sedimentation or decreasing it through reducing, just changing hydrologic flows generally, which starves our marshes of needed sediment to keep up with that sea level rise. I think in the next slide, Eric, can you switch slides? Thank you. You know, in this environment where our marsh is under pressure, we're also potentially considering increasing the amount of impacts that we're going to allow from private recreational dock construction. You know, and I think it's important to underscore what a unique gift we have here in Georgia, that our state has protected our coastal marshland through the Coastal Marshland Protection Act. We have some of the widest swaths of healthy marshland anywhere in the country. And it's because of that protection and stewardship that has historically been applied by the state of Georgia to our coastal marshlands. You know, as the stewards of the public trust, they have a responsibility to, as you heard from April, regulate activities in the marsh and to protect us from some of these impacts. And some of the human impacts that I wanted to talk about were related to viewshed, access, and marine debris. And so I'll talk both about human impacts and ecological impacts. So just to focus on these human impacts for a moment, I think we all can, for those, well, I shouldn't say all, for those of us who are lucky enough to have an opportunity to either view the marsh or to be out in the marsh, either boating or fishing or recreating in some way. You know the difference, or you've seen the difference between areas where the marsh has been largely untouched, has no structures in it, and is robust and healthy and wide, and then areas where there has been a lot of construction, right? Those view sheds are different. And the right to a healthy viewshed is something that the state considers, as is our right to access these tidal lands. They are held in public trust, we all have a right to be able to access our marshlands. And so when you have docks that cross some of the smaller waterways to reach out to deeper water, that access can be impacted if it's not considered. And then something that probably a lot of folks don't think too much about until we're facing a storm is marine debris. So that picture you're seeing there is a picture of a piece of private recreational dock that floated off into the marshland during a storm event, and was there until that state removed it. I think this picture is from North Carolina. I wanted to call attention to a couple of facts related to marine debris specifically here in Georgia. So after Irma and Matthew, the state was responsible for removing that marine debris from the coastal marshlands. And after that, they had to hire a group to remove that marine debris. They removed 15,000 cubic yards, of which 9,000 was actually dock debris. And just for context, I had to look up this fact because 900 cubic yards was a little hard for me to understand what that meant. That was equal to 3,600 F-150 truck beds full of dock debris that were removed after that. And, you know, I think what's interesting when you think about the state's responsibility to deal with that, that as our storms are, you know, as we're impacted by more storms and more violent storms, that the owners of those private recreational docks don't have a responsibility to go out and collect the pieces of that dock, nor are they required legally to actually remove the pieces of docks that remain that are no longer usable. that becomes the responsibility of the state at the expense of the taxpayer. The other fact I saw was in North Carolina, and when they did a study of their dock debris removed after Hurricane Florence, 85% of what they removed was actually from private residential dock debris. All right, next slide. So I think, you know, in order to illustrate the point about how much of our marsh right now is structure-free, impact-free, so to speak, or limited impacts from human development, and part of that is because these regulations that limit dock size and length actually would make it impossible for a dock to be constructed to reach deep water, which of course then creates these large untouched swaths of healthy ecosystems. So if you click from this slide to the next slide, this is in Georgia. This is an existing subdivision. These lots are existing. And right now that marsh is larger than 1,000 feet wide from edge of upland to the coastal, the deep water here. So not to say that everybody here would build a dock if they were allowed to, but if you remove restrictions, this is the potential build out in just this one area. And this condition exists throughout coastal marshlands. So if you would flip back and forth, Eric, just a couple times, I think it helps illustrate what we're talking about when, and tell people understand that as we're looking to strike that balance between private property rights and the public trust, that these rules matter, and they can have what might not seem dramatic can have a dramatic impact on what is constructed in our marsh. All right, next slide. So I also mentioned the ecosystem impacts, and I think a couple of the ones we hear a lot about are shading and marsh rack buildup. This is specific to the marsh grasses that are impacted by the docks that cover it. Shading is the impact that having the dock physically over the grass, the lack of sunlight, reduces the amount of grass and all of the ecosystem and the species that are dependent on that grass within that footprint. The dock can also act as a barrier for marsh rack as it moves throughout the marsh system. It can build up along a dock because it physically prevents the passage of that marsh rack, and that marsh rack can then shade out and impact the grass underneath it. There's also a construction footprint. Obviously, if you're moving heavy equipment through the marsh to build a dock, you're going to leave scars. The pilings have also impacts that last over time. But a lot of these are related to the physical coverage of the dock. And a lot of times you hear people talk about that, just that physical footprint, which of course has an impact. But there's also wildlife impacts and ecosystem impacts that expand far beyond just the physical footprint of the dock. And I mentioned here in this slide just one study that talked about the impact to just the bird species present within the 50-foot buffer of the dock. So that would be a 100-foot corridor along every dock. So that's just one study, but there's plenty of ecosystem impacts. And I think that's what Dr. Cooper is going to talk a little bit about. And so I will turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. My name is Bob Cooper. I am retired from the University of Georgia, where I taught ornithology for about 24 years. I maintain my affiliation with the University of Georgia as an emeritus professor. One of the areas of study that I engaged in was with marsh birds on the Georgia coast, and that's what I would like to focus in on here today. To begin with, I would like to talk a little bit about what's known as the State Wildlife Action Plan. Georgia has one of these. Every state has one of these. The State Wildlife Action Plan guides conservation of the state's species of greatest concern of fish, wildlife, and plants, and also their habitats over the next 10-year period. We just completed one in 2025, so the current plan extends to 2035. And we do this before these native plants and animals become rarer and more costly to conserve and restore. And if you look at the State Wildlife Action Plan, you'll see that salt marsh is an important habitat. And the reason for this is that there are so many species that are of conservation concern that are associated with salt marsh. Some are what we call facultative marsh species. These would be birds that use a number of different habitats, including salt marsh, birds such as shorebirds and wading birds. There are also, there's one species, the salt marsh sparrow, that breeds in the north, but only winters down here in Georgia. But what I would like to focus on are species that breed here and spend really their entire lives here. I should also point out that the State Wildlife Action Plan, when done for each taxonomic group, is not done by just one or two or a handful of people. In the case of birds, the plan was developed by 33 recognized experts in the state of Georgia. Also, I should mention that the primary threats to salt marsh and its wildlife identified in the plan are development and sea level rise. So let's talk a little bit more about the marsh breeders. If I could have the next slide, please, Eric. There are three, and they've all been ranked as having at least high conservation concern, and one of them has the highest conservation concern. The clapper rail, the subspecies of the marsh wren called Worthington's marsh wren, and the subspecies of the seaside sparrow called McGillivray's seaside sparrow. Now, in the case of these latter two, they are also ranked as having critical global importance. And the reason for this is that their geographic range is restricted to Georgia, South Carolina, and a little bit of Florida. So they really occur nowhere else. And one of the most highly ranked species in terms of conservation concern is McGillivray's seaside sparrow. Again, the subspecies that occurs in Georgia. And again, all three of these species virtually spend their entire lives in salt marsh, which otherwise is not very common among birds because of the harsh environment. Next slide, please, Eric. Oh, one other species I feel like I should mention is the eastern black rail. The eastern black rail is federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. It is a federally threatened species. It does occur in salt marsh. It does breed in salt marsh. In the Breeding Bird Atlas, which was done in the 1990s in Georgia, two individuals were detected during the breeding season in coastal habitats, in salt marsh habitats. However, a more intensive survey done in the 20-teens failed to detect any of these birds. It is, however, one of the most, if not the most, secretive and difficult to detect species in North America. So just because the species was not detected doesn't mean that it's not there. The other species I was just talking about, the seaside sparrow, was reviewed for to be considered for federally protected status under the Endangered Species Act in 2017 or 2018. It was decided at that time that its status did not warrant listing, but with some of the effects of development and in particular sea level rise, that status may change if it is reviewed again. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, I mentioned that conditions in salt marshes are extreme, and they are. All birds that nest in salt marshes are faced with a number of extreme conditions: the heat, the salinity, but importantly, the tidal environment in salt marshes. So water levels are rising and falling, and the extreme number of predators that exist in salt marshes. Because there are a number of predators that pretty much come from the land, marsh birds will tend to avoid hammocks and areas with woody vegetation where birds can perch, like these grackles can perch. They will also build their nests down low in the vegetation so that it's well concealed, like the seaside sparrow nest there on the left. The problem is that if birds build their nests too low, because of the extreme tidal amplitude in Georgia, those nests tend to be flooded, and they will be destroyed if they are flooded. So the birds may respond by building their nests higher in the vegetation, in which case they're more visible to predators, in particular predatory birds, and those nests are more vulnerable to predation. This phenomenon has been studied in great detail by Elizabeth Hunter. I was a co-author on these papers. And another thing she found was that seaside sparrows tend to avoid areas near forests and near development, but choose sites with higher elevation, again, to avoid that the potential for flooding. Can I have the next slide, please? This brings us to docks. Now, docks will function in much the same way that upland areas with woody vegetation will function. They provide perch sites for a number of potential nest predators of these marsh bird nests. And we've all seen docks with a lot of birds perched on them, perched on the pilings and the docks themselves. Gulls are potential nest predators. Blackbirds such as grackles, fish crows, raptors, of course, all use docks. And could I have the next slide, please? And even wading birds, such as herons and egrets, are nest predators of birds like seaside sparrows. This may surprise you, but most of these birds, all of these birds, are to some extent opportunistic. And if they are able to find a nest with young in it or eggs, they will prey on those. So many marsh birds then avoid hammocks in other areas with woody vegetation. And similarly, they avoid docks, which are going to provide perch sites for a number of these avian nest predators. A study in Maryland, in fact, showed that obligate marsh birds, that is, birds that are tied to the marsh, like the 3 species I introduced you to a minute ago, were twice as abundant in marshes without docks compared to sites in marshes with docks. Conversely, most of the predatory species I was talking about, gulls, wading birds, blackbirds, crows, etc., were more abundant in areas that had docks. Next slide, please. So because obligate marsh birds tend to avoid docks, these long docks in particular are going to fragment marshes into smaller patches of suitable habitat. This will be because of outright habitat loss in the case of shading and things like rack accumulation, but also because of the effects that they have on nesting birds and the fact that nesting birds will avoid these areas, combined with the effects of sea level rise, which create both effects create smaller and smaller patches of suitable habitat, and this is going to decrease bird diversity and abundance. And this has been shown in a couple of studies done specifically in tidal marsh. But this is a phenomenon that is by no means restricted to salt marsh. The phenomenon of habitat fragmentation has been observed in temperate forests, in tropical forests, grasslands, and tall grass prairie, all with birds. And this would be no exception. And the effect would only be exacerbated by longer docks. Okay, thank you for your attention. I would like to turn it over now to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Guys, my name is Alice Kives, and I'm the Vice President of Coastal Conservation with 100 Miles. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us today, especially the panel members. As y'all have heard, they are experts on Georgia marshes, the species dependent on them, and the laws that protect them. So the main reason for us hosting this webinar today is to prepare for a rulemaking process that the Coastal Resources Division will likely initiate very soon. The rules are very important because they can clarify the standards by which private docks must comply in order to be granted permission or that license that April talked about to impact public marshes. Standards are really intended to allow access to waterways while still protecting the value and the services provided by our publicly owned marshes. And it seems to me, and Courtney mentioned it earlier, that these standards are more important now than ever. Our agencies are being challenged for upholding the state laws and policies that they are charged with upholding. And we are all witnessing a significant increase in development pressure up and down our 100-mile coast. Every community is experiencing it. In fact, there's a trend in many of the fast-growing areas like around Chatham County and even down here in Glenn County, is that real estate agents are witnessing that most true waterfront properties are already pretty much built out and have docks to easy access waterways. But now it's the upland properties that are very far from rivers and creeks that are being advertised and sold as waterfront, when in fact they actually are not waterfront, they're marshfront. So the standards on private docks are not new, again, as April mentioned, and even though this rule will be new, the standards are not new. CRD and the Army Corps have been working on an iterative process to formalize standards since the early 2000s, largely in response to a development boom and a rush for dock permits. To get a handle on that situation back in the 2000s, the agencies convened experts and developed these standards for size limits related to private docks. And what I understand from former agency staff members at the time, the agency priority was for private docks not to overburden the public marshes, and that private docks not be built larger than commercial docks, community docks, and marinas. So the group convened around 2007, again around 2012, and the 2017, the standards under which we're currently operating were adopted. And the next slide, Eric, you'll see that SELC, during one of the discussions in 2012, SELC actually created a map to demonstrate the proliferation of docks that have actually been built. And this is a heavily populated area in Chatham County on Betts Creek. So over the years, regulators, you can go to the next slide. So that's just an example of some of the research that's been done and the investigation that's been done over the years to look at the impacts of docks. Dr. Clark Alexander from Skidaway has a wealth of research on dock shading and marsh rack accumulation that Courtney mentioned earlier. And as Dr. Cooper mentioned earlier, we're learning more and more about the impact docks and habitat fragmentation have on these protected species like the seaside sparrow. So dock standards are designed, these dock standards have evolved over time and continue to allow reasonable access to waterways and still protect the resources that these agencies were charged with protecting. On the next slide, it'll show an image of a good report that Jill Andrews with the Coastal Resources Division developed as an overview of private dock management. I think we'll have a link to this report at the end of the presentation. But going back to April's observation, it's important to reiterate that Georgia's standards, as they currently stand, are not more restrictive than our surrounding states. In fact, our standards are less restrictive than Florida and North Carolina, and fairly consistent with South Carolina. And that chart that April showed earlier is in this CRD report. Which brings us to where we are today. Courtney mentioned that prior to 2022, when the joint permitting process was not renewed, CRD has actually attempted several times to adopt rules governing private docks. Most recently, in January of 2024, CRD released a draft rule and requested comments. Many of you might have submitted comments. Thank you very much. But the result of that public process was not a draft rule that went to the DNR board, but it was the convening of another stakeholder committee to discuss what CRD had developed. work together and then compromise on some of the more controversial standards that were being challenged, and to deliver to the agency recommendations for a new rule. Both Courtney and I were appointed to serve on the committee along with 11 others. We really represented the conservation interests, and the other folks on the committee included elected officials, dock builders, real estate agents, and contractors. We began meeting in July of 2024 and had facilitated meetings. And during those meetings, we discussed and settled on several changes to the draft rule that CRD had proposed in 2024. And that was the result of a lot of discussion and compromise. But to the surprise of many of us, the steering committee was able to deliver to CRD recommendations that had largely consensus support. There were a couple of committee members who were not pleased with the final recommendation. So CRD hosted additional meetings and a facilitator developed a minority report. But it is our hope that CRD will heavily consider the steering committee's near consensus recommendations, as well as the input that the agency receives from the public, which brings us to today. Eric, and you can go to the next slide. CRD has promised to conduct town hall meetings to gather input from the public, from us, prior to releasing their draft rule. So we wanted to make sure that you guys had as much information about the dangers that docks have regarding fragmentation and the other harm that long docks can cause prior to those meetings. And we want to share with you a couple of things to consider, because when we look at the proliferation of docks, the growth development, and the trends that this development is bringing, we're looking at really speaking up to prevent the death of 1,000 cuts, because our marshes are too precious to allow death by 1,000 cuts. So you can go to the next slide. So first and foremost, we hope that you all support CRD moving forward with the rulemaking process. There are some folks out there who believe that our marshes are so extensive that a few docks here and there are great. And it doesn't matter what the impacts may be because our marshes are too plentiful. But as April pointed out, CRD is fully within their legal authority to adopt rules and clarify standards that private docks must comply with. Secondly, is the stakeholder committee recommended that CRD include a requirement that a general contractor is required to build a new dock. Poorly constructed docks are not only a safety hazard, but as Courtney pointed out, as sea level rise and storms become more frequent, they become a real hazard during these storm events and just dump an extensive amount of marsh debris on our tidal lands. So a general contractor and a marine contractor can ensure that new docks are built to last, which would be a good thing. Another recommendation that we would like to share is that these new rules adopt standards that align with the surrounding states as they currently are. Again, Georgia standards are not more restrictive than surrounding states. And in the CRD historical overview, it actually shows a chart that demonstrates that revocable license requests from 2016 to 2022 increased significantly. Some of those include repairs from storms, but I do hope that CRD will release some updated data, because my guess is that the number of applications that they've been receiving in the past 3 years has significantly increased as well. And it's with this increase that brings a big concern that we have for weakening the rules the way that they are currently constructed. Allowing docks to be built over huge swaths of unfragmented, unimpacted marshlands could be detrimental to the overall health of this pristine landscape. So CRD's new rule should not reduce the protections that were developed for a reason by experts and have been in place since 2017. Specifically, we're asking that no private dock standards should exceed those for commercial and community docks. In particular, the new rule should uphold the limit for walkways at 1,000 linear foot or 3,000 square feet. The new rule should not allow bridging over or docks to creeks that are less than 20 feet wide, and that fixed decks and floating docks shouldn't exceed the current standards for navigation, preservation, and for habitat protection. On the next slide, I also want to bring up that the stakeholder added additional recommendation for CRD to consider in a future rulemaking process. And I want to make sure to get this right, because in the recommendation that went to CRD, it was stated that CRD could continue to investigate the development of an objective and science-based model to consider exceedance of current standards in proposed dock design and mitigation practices to reduce the impacts to the marsh using criteria that CRD deems appropriate. It includes shading, marsh rack, as well as fragmentation, habitat, viewshed, cultural and historic resources, etc. So Georgia Conservancy and 100 Miles as stakeholder members have continued to advocate, again, that this rulemaking uphold the current standards, and that if CRD chooses to approach this new process, that any applications to exceed those standards be made available for public review and comment, and that the process avoid fragmentation of these large swaths of unimpacted, unfragmented marsh, that they preserve the viewshed for surrounding landowners and prohibit impacts to historical communities and culturally significant areas. And of course, to require mitigation practices that would diminish the shading impacts and rack accumulation. So you can go to the next slide, Eric. The upcoming town hall meetings are an opportunity for us Georgians and all of those who visit here to celebrate the majesty of Georgia's wet marshlands. It's a chance to tell CRD that we support their efforts, and that we support their efforts, and that we are behind any of their regulations to manage and preserve publicly owned marshlands for the good of the people. We don't yet know when CRD will host the town hall meetings, but as soon as we do, we'll let you know. And I know CRD will post it publicly as well. In the meantime, please consider the information that Eric, April, Courtney, and Bob have shared, and review some of the references that Eric will be sharing with you after the Q&A. We want to make sure that you show up at the town hall meetings, because again, these are designed to collect public opinion to share with CRD before the CRD takes the draft rule to the DNR board related to private dock standards. And of course, like my friend Tamika here, please go out and explore the wonders of coastal Georgia's tapestry of marshlands. Paddle, fish, go bird watching, look for the McGilliry's seaside sparrow. Dr. Cooper, I get that right. But it's really, our marshes are a wonder of the world, and we hope that you will join us in advocating for them. Thank you for your time participating. I think Eric wants to answer some questions now.
Yeah, so I'm going to open up to questions. We have a few out there. I'd just like to say a thank you to our panelists. As I mentioned before, we will have a recording of this available, as well as the main presentation, which will include live links to those resources and references that we've mentioned throughout the presentation today. So one of the first questions I thought was really interesting that I would love to cover, and I'm actually going to stop sharing the screen so we can see each other's faces and work it that way. What is, I think this is mostly a question for all the panelists, but we'll start with Alice. What is the kind of response that some have had in regard to real estate agencies being able to engage them in some way so that at the very least they aren't advertising a property as waterfront that is marshfront? And is there any rules against doing that? It seems like false advertising, someone's commented.
I mean, that's a great question. And Courtney can respond to this as well. When we served on the stakeholder committee, one of the real estate agents who was also on the committee with us was the person who made this observation and brought it to light. I wasn't familiar with it, but I believe that there is a role that the real estate associations and companies can play as they promote the sale of coastal property. Because again, we're developing. We are developing at a very rapid pace right now with single family homes, multiple family homes. And so a lot of the information that we share about the properties themselves has to be has to be accurate. It has to be protective. You know, I think about flood insurance, and I think about some of the new construction that's being built in low-lying areas, and the need to really disclose the information about, you know, the dangers that these places have. But I do believe that advertising marshfront property as waterfront property is really a false advertising. Courtney, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I agree. I think as we, I do hope, that the real estate, interest could play a part, and, help make this, help make that distinction clear for people that are purchasing property. I think it can be a surprise to people that purchase property, advertised as waterfront, assuming that they would be able to build docks, and to find out that they cannot based on the rules that, they didn't have any familiarity with beforehand. And I think that can be an unfortunate situation that puts pressure, on agencies to permit docks, for people who didn't realize, what they were buying up front. So I do hope that I think it's a great question, and I think there's a role to play. And I think it'll become more of an issue, frankly, as there's more and more development, and those, prime, close to deep water lots are sold and developed. That puts pressure on lots that are much further away and behind much larger swaths of marsh to be developed in that same fashion. So I think it'll become more of an issue in the future.
Thank you, Courtney and Alice. We did have from Facebook a student reach out looking into graduate research around the environmental impacts in the Southeast. Could you tell me what research is needed to better understand the environmental impacts of the proposed changes to the dock rules? For example, what would be the focus of a research study if you had the time and funds? I think that's for you, Dr. Cooper.
Sure. Well, my area is birds. And I would say, I included a number of citations of studies that have been done regarding birds and marshes and effects of docks and fragmentation. But a number of those studies were done further north. Although marsh birds have been surveyed up and down the Georgia coast, there haven't been studies that have specifically focused on the effects of docks. And so I would like to see some studies that compare areas with docks and areas without docks, both in terms of just abundance of particular bird species, but also we have in recent years we've gotten a lot of advances have been made in telemetry and being able to follow birds around with radio transmitters on them. They've gotten lighter and smaller so that we can actually put them on birds as small as sparrows. And so studies that track movements of birds, even perhaps before, during, and after construction of a dock or something like that in an area that previously, was undisturbed marsh, would be terribly insightful. And so those are two things just off the top of my mind.
Great. Thank you so much. This is a question from the chat from Susan Shipman. She writes, are neighboring states still working with the Corps of Engineers on issuing programmatic general permits? And I think that might be a question for April maybe, or Courtney or Alice, if you could jump in, but maybe start with April.
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. I mean, I know that they, decided not to reissue the one here. I would imagine they've taken similar stances elsewhere to the extent that they had programmatic general permits, but I'll look to the other panelists to see if they have more information or better information.
Don't hold me to this, but I believe that South Carolina is also expired in 2022. And I believe that Florida's is still active, but they're also on different schedules. So I don't know if it's something that related to expiration of that, or if they have made a different decision about Florida.
I don't have anything to add. That's a very good question. We'll look into it, Susan. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think that there's not a ton of questions left out there, but I would like to invite anyone who would have questions to please reach out. The shared presentation will be coming to you soon. That will have links to my email account and all of our other panelists' contact information if you'd like to reach out to learn more. It will also include a resource page and the references that we had. Oh, it looks like Mark has a question. Mark said, "Is all Georgia marsh considered sensitive bird habitat, or is that a official designation?" Maybe Dr. Cooper, you could answer that.
Um, it's my understanding that, as part of these, again, the State Wildlife Action Plan, that, the salt marsh is an important habitat, primarily because of the species, that occur there. And so it's not an official, designation, but it's one that, is, just part of the overall SWAP, because of the importance of the area due to its wildlife. So yes, it deals with the entire marsh, but no, it's not any kind of official designation.
Thank you. I'm going to check Facebook for one last second. Looks like we're all good there. So, without further ado, I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your expertise. And then for those of you attending, I would just invite you to make sure you check your email for that follow-up from us with all that information. And I am going to end the recording and thank you all and have a great rest of your afternoon. Get out and enjoy the marsh.